Colin Clarke is with the Soufan Center, and he's been a regular on this program. Soufan Center is a think tank. It's a security advisory firm and analysis. And Colin is well acquainted with doing analysis on terrorism, and he's an expert on that. Hi, Colin.
Thanks for having me, Dana.
So much of what we hear, first of all, very broadly on threats, whether they be in America or in Europe, is based on intelligence analysis, right?
Yeah, 100%.
So those very agencies which do the analysis, the FBI, the CIA, independent firms like yourselves that then take some of that analysis and write about it more broadly, they have come under tremendous attack from your president-elect Donald Trump in the past. How do you see the relationship between agencies like the FBI and President-elect Trump in the future? And is that a serious concern?
I think it is a serious concern. I keep grappling with this notion of how similar will the second Trump term be to the first, because that's what we have to go off of, that and the things that he's said. And he has attacked the intelligence agencies quite vigorously before. There's part of me as an American that wants to remain optimistic that this isn't going to be a revenge tour, and that Trump will really consider his legacy with how he deals not only with our allies abroad, but also with the institutions we have here that function as the pillars of our democracy. I think it will be telling the first 6 months of his administration and how he deals with these agencies. One glimmer of hope is a lot of people have focused on Project 2025, which has threatened to kind of hollow out large parts of the U.S. government. He backed away from that quite a bit after the backlash, and I think maybe cooler heads have prevailed. And so, whether or not that was a campaign stunt. Here's the thing about Trump, and I'm not saying this in a pejorative way or in a critical way, although there's plenty to criticize. I think one advantage of having him be largely unmoored from any principles is that he's not an ideologue. He kind of, and you can see that in the way he approaches his foreign policy. One day he threatens to bomb North Korea, the next day he's inviting Kim Jong-un to a summit. There's no real kind of framework that guides him. It's very erratic, but in a sense, that's good because if he has a team around him, of kind of very sober, fairly worldly.
If
If no, and it's a huge if, no question. He's malleable enough where they can help try to guide him to do the right thing. And I also think that again, with his second and final term, he will be focused on his legacy. You've heard him talk about making peace deals, and so I'm hoping that we have a far less erratic administration than we did the first time around.
Take Russia, for example, so people can understand this. I mean, he has rejected some of the intelligence analysis over Russian interference in elections, for instance. If you start rejecting your own intelligence agency's analysis and warnings, and you side with President Putin in the Kremlin, it's a pretty significant danger, isn't it? Because then you're acting in Russia's interest, you're not acting in your own nation's interests. And the next warning may be about something much more serious than not that I'm minimizing election interference as something that's not serious, but
For
it
sure.
could be about a potential nuclear launch, or I don't want to be ridiculous about it, but I mean it
No,
can
it's
be
not
about
ridiculous.
pending military activity, etc.
Look, I just read Bob Woodward's book War, and he went into great detail about how close we were, or how close the intelligence community thought we were to the Russians using a tactical nuke in Ukraine. And thankfully, you know, folks in the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, were very clear about what the consequences would be. But you're right. I mean, when you side with a dictator like Putin over your own intelligence community, not only is that just unwise from a foreign policy perspective,
Yeah.
the morale blow that that deals to the intelligence community has got to be tremendous. I mean, even as a civilian, as an American citizen, I was disgusted by it. I couldn't imagine what it would feel like if I worked in the intelligence community and had the Russia portfolio. I mean, getting your legs cut out from under you. So, it'll be things like that that will be very telling if we start seeing similar behaviors going forward, that we're going to be in for a very rough ride these next 4 years. Again, coming into this with, it's not necessarily a blank slate, but maybe a reset within his own administration. I'm really, really hoping that things go differently this time. Maybe I'm being naive. Maybe this is wishful thinking, but we'll see.
We'll see. You've written the election in the U.S. was heavily marred by foreign interference. In what way? And I saw some of those
Yeah.
bomb threats being reported at various polling stations. And I mean, how big was it, and how did it was it significant in the result, or you think it,
No.
it didn't
No.
change the result?
Did not change the result. I mean, it was an overwhelming mandate for Trump if you look at the map. And no amount of Russian interference would have tilted the election that far for him. I think the American people spoke, and they spoke loudly. There was bomb threats, there was massive disinformation, AI generated fake videos, the usual that we see from the Russians. But no, the interesting part to me is for an administration that cried foul and fraud for the last election, now that they won, there was magically none, right? Which just kind of goes to show you, how valid the initial claims were. But no, I mean the if you look at how dominant Trump performed in this election, you really have to kind of discount in some ways the impact of foreign interference. Now, what we can't discount is the impunity with which the Russians and to a
Yeah,
lesser the Iranians and the Chinese think that
exactly.
they can
I
fill in
mean,
our
if
elections. There's got to
I
be a
don't want
price.
to I don't want to
Right.
overstate it, but if you said like 10 years ago, interfering in democratic elections would almost be an act of war. I mean, no way. That was a red line. Now it's commonplace in every single election. We're hearing Iran, China, Russia setting up, you wrote about so-called, how did you put it, doppelganger
Doppelganger.
networks of websites imitating real media. I mean,
So part of it is the lowering of barriers to entry that technology allows anybody to kind of muck around in this space. And I think that's why the response hasn't been as severe, is because this is just par for the course now across the board. In every Democratic election we see. But I do think it's a mistake that we've kind of internalized this and just kind of shrugged of like, well, kind of what can you do, right? This is the way things go.
what do you
Um,
do?
I think, you start looking into sanctions to begin with. You start looking into turning the tables. Here's where the intelligence community could get creative and giving the Russians a dose of their own medicine, perhaps. But sitting back passively and allowing countries to meddle in your elections is absolutely not the answer. But, again, I do have faith and confidence in CISA, the Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency, and some of the leadership there, and that they're doing everything they can to maintain the integrity of our elections.
You've also written 4 more years of Trump could see a resurgence of domestic terror, uh,
Right.
neo-Nazis, white supremacists. And then, as I was waiting to do this interview with you, I see the breaking news in the US that the FBI now is investigating a spate of emails that were sent to brown and black Americans telling them they should report to the cotton fields, even children.
Sure.
So why does a new Trump administration equate with more the sense from these groups that they can act without impunity with impunity?
I think it emboldens people. I think, a slice of the MAGA movement is virulently racist. I'm not saying it's anywhere close to a majority, but there are people that revel in some of the kind of racist rhetoric, frankly, the Great Replacement theory, all these other things. There are true believers that really fundamentally believe that there is a conspiracy or a cabal of Democrats, Jews, and folks in Hollywood that are actively trying to replace white people with immigrants. And you know, some of the things that Trump has said may very well be the wink, wink, nod, nod that these people need to go forth and unleash acts of violence. We saw it in my own city in Pittsburgh in 2018 with Robert Bowers, where he almost thought that he was doing something for a greater good. Screw your optics, I'm going in, right, is what he said in response to this migrant caravan. We saw it in El Paso with Patrick Crusius when he attacked a Walmart because of elements of the Great Replacement. And so my concern is that people feel emboldened to quote unquote finish the job and target what he's called the enemies within, right? They're poisoning our blood. And even though it's not the government that's condoning these things, it's people taking matters into their own hands. And in a country like the United States, where everybody has access to high-powered weaponry, it looks a lot different than it would in Europe or Australia or somewhere else.
If you're concerned about domestic terror, internationally, what do you see in kind of the short term that you've written about the resurgence of ISIS and ISIS-K? Um, it seems like we're very focused on state to state conflict right now. But
Everything's
while
about
our
great power
eyes are
competition.
there, there's a lot happening with terror groups that have not gone away.
No doubt, if you go down to the Beltway in Washington, there's three things people want to talk about: China, China, and China. Maybe a little bit of AI. Nobody wants to talk about counterterrorism. There's a significant sense of counterterrorism fatigue, I think, after 20 years of the so-called global war on terrorism that's permeated the larger part of the body politic.
But that's a luxury, right? Because until
Sure
the next
is.
bomb goes off, you have that people might be fatigued until that moment.
I'd go further. I wouldn't even use luxury. I'd say it's complacency. I think it's very dangerous, in fact, because these groups have not gone away. We're out of Afghanistan. That's helped lead to the resurgence of ISIS-K, which has also set its sights on countries globally, and not just the West, mind you. They attacked Iran in January and Russia in March. Um, but certainly they would love to pull off some kind of major terrorist attack in Europe or the United States. And if that does happen, then we can get into these kind of second and third order outcomes. This is where Trump's unpredictable nature might surprise some people. Largely, he's seen as wanting to draw down U.S. presence overseas. But if there's a major terrorist attack on U.S. soil on his watch, depending on how serious and severe it is, maybe he deploys the military to somewhere we haven't been prior. It's not completely implausible. Uh,
Am I right in saying, I mean, Trump may be faulted for a lot of things in his first term, a lot of things on foreign
for sure.
policy, but the one thing he did do was go after ISIS.
He did, and we have to give credit where credit's due. Look, this is where I think we get in a lot of trouble in this country. The level of hatred for Trump has blinded analysts from doing their job objectively. And no doubt it's a challenge, to assess him like you would assess any other president or any other administration. But I look at that as our job. You can't take into account your personal feelings, your ideology, if you want to be a credible analyst. And I think without question, he did a very good job going after the Islamic State. Now, there's some hyperbole there, right? I defeated ISIS. Well, we all know that ISIS isn't dead. Look at ISIS-K, and even look back in Iraq and Syria. The U.S. conducted airstrikes in Syria against ISIS targets just last week. We still have the camps in Al-Hol in northeastern Syria, where we've had a policy of kind of kick the can down the road. The ISIS threat is percolating. It's very much there, and it could revive. There's different geopolitical factors that could influence the reinvigoration of this group. And you're 100% right. We can't afford to be complacent there.
And there's been certainly attacks that have been carried out by Iran, even within Europe itself, assassination attempts. We might see President Trump get very, very tough with Iran, much tougher than the Biden administration was.
He could, and I think that's another challenge. We did a project a couple of years ago, um, and as part of the project, we were doing interviews with high-ranking current and retired security, intelligence, and defense officials in the UK. And one in particular had a comment that's really stuck with me, and it's quite, resonant. He said, "Nothing ever falls off the plate." And what he meant by that was we have these old threats. Al Qaeda's still there, ISIS is still there, but we have these new threats too, right? Now we have far right extremism. We have the axis of resistance. We're now kind of going to see a regrowth of Shia extremism and terrorism, but the old threats haven't gone away. And so the picture at one point was fairly narrowly focused on, Sunni jihadists, Salafi jihadists. It's now this kind of kaleidoscope of threats. And I do think, the threat from Lebanese Hezbollah, from the Houthis, from Hamas, we don't know what shape those are going to take in the near future. The Israelis have, dismantled these organizations in some ways, but I warn people, the second order effect of that could be, more terrorism worldwide. Think back to 1992 after the first after Hassan Nasrallah's predecessor was killed. Um, Hezbollah responded by attacking Jewish and Israeli targets in Latin America, in Argentina. So, do we enter a period or a phase where U.S. embassies in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia are being attacked? Because Hezbollah is a global network, and if United States is in the kind of crosshairs of that group, that's certainly a possibility.
with capabilities increased by Iranian sponsorship.
No question. I mean, largely undergirded by, Iranian and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force training.
So state-sponsored terrorism. Would you comment, Colin, on uh, what kind of has been spinning around for the last week that Russia was behind sending explosive packages to Europe that could have downed aircraft, but they were, detected on the ground in places like sorting facilities before they exploded.
Look, I wrote a piece for the LA Times back in February 2022, shortly after the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine, where I warned, if we start to see Russian battlefield losses in Ukraine, one byproduct could be terrorism in the West, because the West has rallied, because NATO has rallied to support the Ukrainians. And, it wasn't that revolutionary of a statement. We've seen Russian terrorism in the West before that. Let's look at the Litvinenkos. Let's look at some of the things that the Russians have done, blowing up arms depots in parts of Bulgaria and the Czech Republic, an assassination of a Chechen dissident in Berlin in broad daylight. So, the Russians are not afraid to conduct acts of terrorism. They've also now, they're going to be dealing with the return of these Wagner folks, or whatever you want to call them now, back into regular Russian society, who maybe, are heavily battle scarred, have maybe been conscripted from prisons. What becomes of these people? The Russians aren't going to want them running around on Russian soil, so maybe they're kind of dispatched or deployed in different ways. I think we're in for a really turbulent time with the Russians, particularly with the posture toward Europe, and that's put Ukraine, how that conflict ends aside, this is a clear signal to the West that the Russians are not afraid to take that next step. I mean, taking out a plane with an explosive, pretty drastic. This isn't kind of what we call salami slicing or incremental terrorism. This is a very blatant, clear sign of what the Russians are prepared to do.
And you have a president who, a second-term president, Donald Trump, who wants to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours and have a great relationship with President Putin. It's not really seemingly based in any kind of reality right now.
It's not, and again, my hopes are that his advisors can kind of, convince him that Putin is not our friend. And again, you have to think of some of the drastic kind of 180s Trump did during his first administration. What's to say that Trump doesn't hate Putin 6 months into this? I know it's implausible, or it's hard to fathom given the kind of bromance that they've had, for lack of a better term. But uh, geopolitics makes for strange bedfellows. If Trump feels that Putin is kind of, embarrassing him or trying to show him up in some ways, we don't know how he'll react.
Colin Clarke with the Soufan Center. Colin, great to talk to you again. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dana.